Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are ya? Tonight I'm headed off to see Skinny Puppy's last Houston concert on their farewell tour. This is kind of a big deal to me, although their last two releases were hardly my favorite. The band has been a regular in my everyday playlists since 1990, and I've seen them 4 or 5 times now, including once while in college. While they are certainly an acquired taste, a listen to their discography will tell you just how far ahead of their time they were, and how many of today's bands, even still, mark them as an influence. I imagine tonight will be loud, fake blood will be all over the place, and Ogre, the singer human noise machine, will stalk the stage wearing strange costumes and growling out fever dreams. I expect that tomorrow morning my neck and back will hurt, my ears will be unhappy, and I'll be depressed that it wasn't everything I'd hoped for. Regardless, it'll be another passing of my favorite bands. Today I'll fill up a playlist with favorites, keep the volume low to mid, and sing along as I get my day job on while dreaming of being in a club as a much younger man, thrashing my body against others and dancing like a spasmodic dervish, all while liters of sweat pour off me beneath my leather jacket. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 9 of The Black.
Chapter 5. Mornings were Rabel's favorite time of day. He loved waking up before the sun and watching it rise over the horizon as he sipped cup after cup of black coffee. When he woke that morning, however, he wasn't happy. Sleep had been fickle to non-existent. The crazy shit Calhoun and Shauna had written in the report had haunted him all night. He was right to have emailed Simpson and let the exec know there was a possible problem aboard Leaguer. He'd taken great pleasure in pointing out it was Simpson's hires that were the problem. Simpson hadn't responded. Yet. And that was the other problem. He'd tweaked Calhoun hard last night, implied the engineer had gone insane, senile or both. After the man had left the bridge and Rabel had time to think about his words, a sinking feeling hit the pit of his stomach. He had met masters of the career-limiting move. Those were people on the rise who shot their mouth off one too many times. Piss off the wrong exec at the top and you'd never get promoted. If you angered enough of them, they'd give you a window seat or just find a way to fire you. He didn't know Simpson well enough to gauge how the man would react to the email. Calhoun? He didn't know the engineer at all. At least JP didn't seem concerned. The man had volunteered for inspection duty. Belmont and his dive crew were scheduled to perform a routine sweep of the substructure as soon as they arrived at the second spud site. It would take a few hours at most. As long as JP was off the damned rig, Rabel could relax. A little. But that didn't make the bad feeling go away. Ocean floors didn't move unless there was magma involved, either through eruption or an earthquake. The idea the floor was shifting was insane. He kept trying to imagine it, but his brain wouldn't cooperate. It just sounded crazy. And the oil? It's fucking oil. That thought bounced in his head all night, but Shauna had looked terrified. When he mentioned they were going to drill another well, the color had bleached out of her face. And when she pointed out the spot on the map last night, her hand had been shaking. The bullshit about a possible gas pocket? Yeah, he didn't believe that one either. There was a reason she and Calhoun had chosen the thickest part of the crust. He had a feeling they weren't going to tell him why. Rabel stood on the bridge as the morning shift appeared on deck. Gomez was out there, his bright red hard hat making him impossible to miss. The clouds had thickened overnight, and the sun was barely visible through the soup, but that wasn't going to stop the next drill string. Shouldn't it? A voice said in his mind. Shouldn't you just stop for a moment and take a look around? Rabel shook his head to clear it. Not enough sleep. He was jittery and exhausted. The numbers from the oil analyses kept running through his mind. An impossible gravity, an impossible water content, and an impossibly sweet crude. All PPE would have to do was filter out any particulates, and then they could refine to their heart's content. They sat on top of a goddamn gold mine of oil, and he, Rabel, would get credit for bringing in the greatest find since Nigeria. An acidic burp escaped his mouth and his stomach burned. This was bullshit. A goddamn nightmare Calhoun and Shauna had conjured to what? That's what didn't make any goddamn sense. There was nothing for them to gain by manufacturing evidence or analysis. He could see JP or that asshole Catfish setting all this in motion just to tweak him. But Calhoun and Shauna? He took another sip from the mug and realized it was empty. Rabel swiveled in his chair and eyed the coffee machine. Another burp of heartburn escaped his lips, and he sighed. Instead of rising from his chair to get another cup, he rolled the mug between his hands. Simpson wanted another well. Calhoun and Shauna had told him where to drill. Gomez and the crew were getting ready to build another drill string. And what was Rabel doing? Rabel was thinking about how it was a goddamn bad day to be a rig chief. The radio squawked. "Leaguer, this is Hilo 115 Heavy, over," a female voice said. The acid in his stomach settled at once, and a grin filled his face. At least something is going right today. He pulled the mic over. 1-1 Heavy, this is Leaguer, over. There was a slight pause, and then the voice came back to him, the whine of engines barely audible in the background. "Leaguer, we are 30 minutes out. Please have the cargo ready. We don't have a lot of fuel reserves. Over." "Understood, 115 Heavy. Should we have anything else ready for you? Over." The pilot chuckled. "Unless you have some whiskey, we'll just take the cargo. Over." Rabel laughed. "Sorry, 115. We have plenty of coffee and anything else you could desire, but that's about it. Over." "Damn," the voice said. "Oh well, I tried. Hilo 115 out." For the first time that morning, he felt as though the day might not be a complete shit sandwich. The PPE helicopter was early. That meant the oil sample would get off the rig and head to Houston sooner than he'd hoped. By tomorrow or the next day, they'd be working another drill string. The fatigue that fogged his brain disappeared. He pulled a yellow telephone receiver from the console and heard the buzz of the ringer on the other end until someone picked it up. "Gomez." "The Hilo is about 30 minutes out. Please check the helipad and make sure the sample is ready for them. Sounds like an immediate dust-off," Rabel said. "Understood, Chief. We'll be ready." "Rabel out," he said, and dropped the phone back in its cradle. He looked down at the deck. Gomez was pointing at several of his men and then to the helipad. The men nodded and then made their way up the superstructure. Rabel smiled. Clockwork. Clockwork is how everything should work. He stood from the chair, turned toward the coffee machine, and then stopped in his tracks. Catfish stood at the hatch threshold with freshly washed hair that was tied back in a braid. For once, the man was dressed in a PPE polo shirt and a pair of faded pants. He wore boots instead of sandals. "You have a moment, Mr. Rabel?" the tech asked. The rig chief forced a smile. "Sure." Catfish cleared his throat. "I'd like permission to send out an AUV." Rabel watched the tech's body language. The man was obviously stressed. About what, Rabel wasn't certain. "May I ask why?" A slight smile tugged at Catfish's lips. "One last shakeout with some new programming. Need to make sure we're ready for the next drill string." For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the occasional bang or grind from the deck below and the air conditioning. He waited for Catfish to stammer or say something else, but the man didn't. "Of course," Rabel said. "I assume you'll want to go with JP?" Catfish shook his head. "No, I'm needed at my console, sir." "Okay, tell JP to get with someone from Belmont's team. Let me know when it's in the water." "Will do. Thank you," Catfish said. He left the bridge and headed down the hall at a fast walk. Rabel watched him go. The surly tech seemed to have had a major attitude adjustment. Calhoun must have told his team they were on the verge of being fired. Bullshit, of course. While he'd threatened to have Calhoun and Shauna removed, the rig couldn't possibly do its job without an ROV AUV pilot, at least not in water this deep. Stomach settled, he pushed the coffee mug into the machine and started the process. He'd thought about finding Calhoun and apologizing, or at least sending another email to Simpson to explain he'd been rash. But neither was a good idea. He'd deal with whatever Simpson threw at him. And Calhoun? If the man was finally going to keep his team in line and not spread hysteria among the crew, it would be good to have his expertise on board, at least until they were done with 2 more test wells. Rabel walked to the situation board on the wall and studied the schedule. Gomez's crew was calibrating the sensors for the next coordinate. By that afternoon, they should have the laser guidance directed on the exact spot for the new spud site. They'd use Leaguer's thrusters to float the rig on top of the target. Once they started lowering the drill string, Catfish's ROV would hold things steady at 18,000 feet. The ROV could then make any adjustments necessary for the drill string to hit its mark. It wouldn't take long. A day from now, maybe 2, they'd be back to drilling and get another sample. In 3 to 4 days, they'd probably have the report back from Houston. If it was good news, they could drill 2 more test wells and send all 3 sample barrels back to Houston for confirmation. Once that was done, they'd know it was a gold rush. If this was a success, Rabel could look forward to manning the production rig that would ultimately replace Leaguer. If we make it that far, a voice said in his mind. He ignored it. He was not going to let those thoughts control him. He had a job to do, and so did everyone else on the rig. With that in mind, he checked the time on the console. In 20 minutes or so, the helo would land. He sipped his coffee and watched as the deck crew inspected the helipad. Clockwork, he thought. Breakfast had come and gone, leaving Calhoun and Catfish alone in the drilling office. Catfish was rapidly going over the diagnostics for each of the remaining AUVs, and of course AUV-5 in particular. The drill string would start its drop tomorrow. It would punch into the ocean floor, and then the crew would drop concrete casing and a blowout preventer. Once that happened, they could put the drill bit into action and start drilling. Time to get all that going? Less than 24 hours. Catfish's AUV would already be sweeping the ocean floor, especially around their target drill point. Calhoun hoped Shauna's hunch was right about hitting the deepest point in the survey. The bullshit line she'd fed Rabel about a possible gas pocket was perfect. The rig chief had looked dubious about her explanation, but didn't offer any resistance, which probably meant he was convinced anywhere in the trench would bring up a ton of oil. At least he might stay the fuck out of their way now. When Calhoun logged into his laptop that morning, he found an email from Simpson waiting for him. The engineer had sucked his teeth while he read it, but he didn't get angry. Simpson wanted to know, in his words, what the hell is going on out there? Calhoun wanted an answer to that question, too. He responded by explaining the concerns in the report and the fact Rabel didn't appreciate their conclusions. He also pointed out the possibility that the oil was contaminated, but required further tests in Houston before that was proven. "I'll work with Rabel," he typed, "until such time as my team's expertise is no longer required. I'll leave that decision to you." Calhoun was an old hand at dealing with angst-ridden executives. Whether he was an employee or a contractor didn't matter. Eventually, the execs treated him like an indentured servant regardless of his credentials and reputation. They wanted what they wanted. For some reason, many in the industry still hadn't learned the lessons from dead rigs, dead wells, and dead people. He paused after finishing the email. A quick browse through his bookmarks and seeing the day's news allowed him time to forget the words he'd written. Back in the old days when writing reports or responding to correspondence, he'd learned that once you typed something up, you should always take a few minutes to forget about it before putting it in the mail. It gave you time to consider your words and decide both the impact and possible ramifications. In the industry, there were always consequences to hasty remarks. While Simpson couldn't destroy his reputation, he could certainly make sure that PPE never hired any of his crew again. Getting blackballed by one company was hardly the end of a career, especially considering every oil company out there had a shortage of staff. But Calhoun didn't want it to get that far. If PPE was successful here, it meant a lot more work and something he could retire on. That was enough to make him play nice. Or want to. He ended up sending the email without changing a single word. Sometimes you just had to stick to your guns. Simpson would cringe when he saw the implied challenge, which amounted to, "If you think Rabel can handle everything, then get us the hell out of here already." Regardless of the problems Rabel had with Calhoun's team and their analyses, Simpson would be smart enough to realize it was a bad idea to remove them while the rig was still drilling wells. Harriban might be okay, or even great with the mud logging, but he wasn't a geologist or petrochemist. He had no specialties in those disciplines, and replacing Shauna would be impossible on such short notice. And Catfish? Without a pilot, his robots were useless. And while PPE might have paid for the damned things, the code and design were property of both Catfish and Calhoun. JP was the only one they could readily replace, but that would leave the rig a diver short. It would only take a few days to get a new face with fins out to the rig, but he imagined the logistics would be a nightmare. Rabel didn't like being stuck with people he didn't pick, hence the tension in the first place. When Calhoun left his room to get some breakfast, he let the thoughts slip away. Instead, he focused on the news and the weather. The storm to the south was moving, and not in a friendly direction. It could swing up toward the rig at any time, Once that happened, life would get interesting. Rabel seemed like a stickler for safety, but when a storm like that bore down on an offshore rig, even the most routine operations became more hazardous than usual. With those thoughts in his mind, he entered the drilling office expecting to see Shauna. When all he saw was Catfish, he started to head back to the personnel cabins. "Boss?" Catfish said from his terminal. "Yeah," Calhoun replied. "Can you give a look at AUV-3? I need to run more diagnostics and could use a second pair of eyes." Heaving a sigh, Calhoun sat at the workstation next to Catfish. After logging in and capturing the diagnostic reports from the shared drive, he lost himself in the reports. He and Catfish worked side by side for over an hour. They barely spoke to one another as they pored over the information. By the time Calhoun heard the helicopter landing on the rig, he'd forgotten all about Shauna and the report. Both he and Catfish rose from their chairs to look out the windows as the huge bird landed. In the old days, most rigs had helipads only large enough to take on small helicopters. Since the advent of OSHA rules regarding life, flight, and etc., rigs had to be designed with the larger copters in mind. If they had to travel long distances, they had to carry a lot of fuel, which meant larger machines and larger helipads. Calhoun didn't envy the poor bastards who had to give up another 40 feet of space to make room for them. Rigs were packed as tight as they could be, and that was a precious amount of real estate. The helo was the size of a Coast Guard chopper, and its blue and white body sported a large black PPE logo painted on the tail. As the two of them watched, a man dressed in fatigues and a blue helmet slid open the port side hatch. 3 roughnecks lifted an orange barrel into the helicopter's open door. Calhoun frowned. "Have you seen Shauna today?" Catfish turned from the window. No. Kind of odd, actually. Hope she made the changes to the report." "What changes?" Catfish asked. Calhoun grunted. "The ones where we warned Houston that the barrel might be contaminated with something?" Catfish blinked. "You really do believe that, don't you?" The engineer stepped away from the window and walked back to the workstation. He rubbed his eyes before he crumpled in his chair. "Yeah, I do. This stuff doesn't act like oil. It doesn't read like oil, and yet the hydrocarbon concentrations are off the charts." "When I get the reports back from AUV-2, Catfish said, "McCauley should be able to get us a bead on what's down there, or at least what she thinks is down there." Calhoun shook his head. "The tube worms, the ocean floor, the oil." He rapped his knuckles on the desk. "What the hell is going on in lower midnight?" A cloud of vapor filled the air above Catfish's head. He was sucking on the e-cig again. "Maybe we're just hitting 3 for 3 on the weird shit-o-meter." "I don't think these are coincidences," he said. "Have you gone over the footage from AUV-5? Catfish shook his head. "I was so busy looking at the diagnostics and restructuring the program for the next drill string, I completely forgot." "Damn it," Calhoun said. "I need to find Shauna. We need help if we're going to get everyone's eyes on this." "Calhoun to the bridge," a voice said over the intercom. "Thomas Calhoun to the bridge, please." "Fuck me," he breathed. "Excuse me, I have to go deal with Rabel." "That should be entertaining," Catfish chuckled. "Want me to go find Shauna?" Calhoun nodded. "Yeah, get her ass in here. We need to start going over the footage."